Frank Sinatra was walking down the narrow backstage corridor of the Coconut Grove when he heard it. Crying. Not the soft, performative kind an actress might use while rehearsing a scene. This was different. This was raw, uncontrolled. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it can't be hidden or faked. Frank slowed his steps. Then he stopped completely. The sound was coming from behind a closed door. Marilyn Monroe's dressing room. For a long moment he stood there, unsure of what to do. In Hollywood, you learned quickly to mind your own business. You didn't interrupt private moments. You didn't ask questions. You pretended not to notice what happened behind closed doors. But something about that crying reached him. It sounded familiar. It echoed his own loneliness, his own private pain, the kind no applause could erase. And so Frank Sinatra did something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He knocked. It was June of 1954. Sinatra had just won the Academy Award for From Here to Eternity. Against all odds, he was living his second act. Only 2 years earlier, in 1952, his voice had faltered, his career had collapsed, and Hollywood had quietly written him off. But Frank had fought his way back. He was recording again, performing again, believing in himself again. That night, he was headlining at the Coconut Grove, one of Los Angeles' most prestigious nightclubs. The room was packed with Hollywood's elite, studio heads, stars, power brokers, every table filled. And somewhere in that audience, glowing even without the spotlight, was Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn was at the absolute peak of her fame. She'd just finished filming The 7-Year Itch. The iconic image of her standing over the subway grate, her white dress blowing up, was about to make her the most famous woman in the world. But Frank knew something most people didn't. He knew that Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jean, the woman beneath the platinum blonde hair and the breathy voice, were two completely different people. And Norma Jean was suffering. Frank had finished his first set. He was walking backstage to his dressing room when he passed Marilyn's. The venue had given her a dressing room as a courtesy, even though she wasn't performing. She was there as a guest, as a star, as someone the photographers would want to capture. Frank heard the crying and stopped. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening. The sound was getting worse, more desperate, more broken. Frank knocked gently. "Marilyn, it's Frank. You okay in there?" The crying stopped immediately. Silence, then a voice, trying desperately to sound normal. "I'm fine, Frank. Thank you. I'll be out in a minute." But her voice cracked on the word fine. Frank knew that sound. He'd made that same sound himself when he was pretending everything was okay while falling apart inside. "Marilyn, I'm coming in," Frank said quietly. "If you don't want me to, say so now." Silence. No response. Frank took that as permission. He opened the door slowly. What he saw made his heart break. Marilyn Monroe was sitting on the floor of her dressing room, not on the couch, not in the chair. On the floor, with her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her carefully applied makeup was running down her face in black streaks. Her platinum blonde hair, usually perfectly styled, was disheveled. She was wearing a stunning white evening gown, the kind that cost thousands of dollars. But she looked like a lost child, wearing her mother's clothes. Frank closed the door behind him quietly. He didn't rush over to her. He didn't bombard her with questions. He just stood there for a moment, letting her know he wasn't going to judge her, wasn't going to pity her, wasn't going to tell anyone what he was seeing. "I'm sorry," Marilyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. This is embarrassing. I don't know what's wrong with me." Frank walked over slowly and sat down on the floor next to her. Not too close, just close enough to show he was there. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about," Frank said quietly. "Trust me." I've had my share of sitting on floors crying. Sometimes floors are better than chairs. Marilyn looked at him through her tears, and for just a second, she almost smiled. Almost. "Why are you being nice to me?" Marilyn asked. "Everyone wants something. What do you want?" Frank thought about that question. It was a devastating question. The idea that this woman, this icon, couldn't comprehend someone being kind without an agenda. "I don't want anything, Marilyn. I heard someone crying, and I wanted to make sure they were okay. That's all." Marilyn studied his face, trying to determine if he was lying. Frank just looked back at her with honest eyes. Finally, Marilyn's defenses crumbled. "I can't do this anymore, Frank. I can't be her anymore." "Be who?" Marilyn Monroe, the character, the act. Everyone wants Marilyn. Nobody wants Norma Jean, and I don't know how to be Marilyn all the time. It's exhausting. Frank understood that more than she knew. He'd spent years being Frank Sinatra, the persona, the cool, confident, untouchable singer, and it had nearly destroyed him. "What happened tonight?" Frank asked gently. Marilyn wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. "Joe and I had a fight. A bad one. He's furious about the subway grate scene. He says I'm humiliating him, that I'm making myself into a sex object, that I'm not respecting our marriage." Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's husband, a baseball legend who wanted a traditional wife and instead got the most desired woman in the world. Frank had met Joe a few times. Good man, but completely wrong for Marilyn. "And what do you think?" Frank asked. Marilyn's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I think he's right. I think everyone sees me as a body, as a face, as a fantasy. Nobody sees me as a person. Nobody cares what I think or what I feel. They just want me to show up, look beautiful, and play dumb." "You're not dumb," Frank said firmly. Marilyn laughed bitterly. "Everyone thinks I am. The studio, the directors, the press. They all think I'm just a pretty face with nothing behind it. And maybe they're right. Maybe that's all I am." Frank turned to face her more directly. "Listen to me, Marilyn. I've been in this business long enough to know who's real and who's not. You're real. The pain you're feeling right now, that's real. That means you're human. That means you're more than the image." Marilyn looked at him with such desperate hope. Like she wanted to believe him but didn't know how. "I'm so tired, Frank. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of smiling when I want to scream. I'm tired of being touched by people I don't want touching me. I'm tired of directors telling me to be sexier, breathier, dumber. I'm tired of being lonely in rooms full of people." Frank knew that feeling. God, did he know that feeling? "When my voice gave out in 1952, Frank said quietly, I thought my life was over. I sat in my apartment for months, unable to speak, unable to sing. And you know what the worst part was? The silence from everyone I thought cared about me. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations stopped coming. I learned real fast that people loved Frank Sinatra, the star. They didn't love Frank, the person." Marilyn was listening intently now. "How did you survive it?" "I didn't. At first, I drank. I wallowed. I felt sorry for myself. But eventually, I realized something. The voice that came back wasn't the same voice I'd lost. It was different, deeper, rougher, more honest. And that honesty connected with people in a way my old voice never did. I stopped trying to be perfect. I started being real. I don't know how to be real," Marilyn whispered. "Everyone wants the illusion. If I show them the real me, they'll be disappointed." "Some will," Frank admitted, "but the ones who matter won't. And more importantly, you'll be able to live with yourself." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marilyn said something that would echo in Frank's mind for decades. I think about dying sometimes, Frank. Not in a scary way. Just as an escape. As a way to stop having to be Marilyn Monroe. Frank's blood ran cold. He'd had those thoughts himself during his darkest days, but hearing them from Marilyn, seeing the genuine exhaustion in her eyes, terrified him. Marilyn, listen to me. I need you to promise me something. She looked at him. What? Promise me that before you do anything, before you make any permanent decisions, you'll call me. Day or night. I don't care what time it is. You call me and we'll talk. Promise me. Marilyn studied his face. Why do you care? Because I see myself in you. Because I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning while everyone thinks you're swimming. Because nobody should feel that alone. Promise me, Marilyn. After a long moment, Marilyn nodded. I promise. Frank pulled out his wallet and wrote his private phone number on a business card. This is my direct line, not my agent, not my manager. Me. You call that number and I'll answer. Even if I'm on stage, even if I'm sleeping, I'll answer. Marilyn took the card with shaking hands. Thank you, Frank. I mean it, Marilyn. You're not alone in this. I know it feels like you are, but you're not. They sat there for another 20 minutes. Frank told her stories about his comeback, about sitting on the floor of his own apartment, convinced he'd never sing again. About the moment his voice came back different, but better. About learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Marilyn listened like she was hearing gospel. Someone who understood. Someone who'd been where she was. Someone who'd survived it. When Marilyn's makeup artist knocked on the door to fix her face before she had to appear in public again, Frank stood up. He offered Marilyn his hand and pulled her to her feet. You're going to be okay, Frank said. I don't know how yet, but you will. Marilyn hugged him suddenly. A real hug, not a Hollywood air kiss, a genuine embrace. Thank you for not walking past my door, she whispered. Frank hugged her back. Any time, Marilyn. I mean that. Any time. Frank left her dressing room and went back to his own. He stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. He'd seen behind the curtain. He'd seen the real Marilyn Monroe, and what he'd seen terrified him, because he recognized that level of pain, that level of exhaustion, that level of wanting it all to stop. Frank performed his second set that night, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about Marilyn, about the way she'd said she thought about dying as an escape, about the desperation in her eyes. After the show, Frank saw Marilyn in the club. She'd fixed her makeup, put her smile back on. She was Marilyn Monroe again, laughing with photographers, posing for pictures, being the fantasy everyone expected. But when her eyes met Frank's across the room, he saw the truth. He saw Norma Jean behind Marilyn's eyes, and she gave him the smallest, saddest smile. A smile that said, "Thank you for seeing me." Frank nodded back, a nod that said, "I see you. I'll always see you." Over the next few months, Frank tried to stay connected to Marilyn. He'd call her occasionally, just to check in, just to remind her she had someone who understood. Sometimes she'd answer, and they'd talk for hours, about everything and nothing, about the absurdity of fame, about feeling like frauds, about missing their old lives before everything got complicated. Other times, she wouldn't answer, and Frank would worry. In October 1954, Marilyn and Joe DiMaggio divorced. The marriage lasted less than a year. Frank heard through the Hollywood grapevine that Marilyn was devastated. He called her. She didn't answer. He called again the next day. Still no answer. On the third day, she picked up. "I'm okay, Frank," she said, but her voice said otherwise. "You don't sound okay." "I will be. I just need time." "Marilyn, you still have my number, right? The promise still stands." "I know, thank you, Frank, really." But Frank could hear her pulling away, could hear her retreating back into herself. He wanted to help, wanted to save her. But he was learning a painful lesson. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can only be there when they're ready to save themselves. In 1955, Marilyn moved to New York to study at the Actors Studio. She was trying to be taken seriously as an actress, trying to be more than just a sex symbol. Frank admired her for that. He called her when he was performing in New York. They'd meet for dinner occasionally, late-night diners where nobody would recognize them, where they could just be Frank and Norma Jean. During one of those dinners, Marilyn told Frank about her sessions with her acting coach, Lee Strasberg. "He says I have real talent, that I'm not just a movie star, I'm an actress." Her eyes were bright with hope. "He's right," Frank said. "You are talented. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "You really think so?" "I know so. I've been watching you perform since the moment I met you. Even when you're playing Marilyn, you're acting. And you're damn good at it." Marilyn smiled, a real smile. "Thank you, Frank. You always know what to say. I just tell you the truth, something nobody else in this town seems capable of." They talked late into the night, and for a few hours, Marilyn seemed lighter, happier, more herself. Frank hoped that maybe she was finding her way. Maybe she was learning to be okay. But Hollywood doesn't let people be okay. In 1956, Marilyn married Arthur Miller, the playwright. Frank thought maybe this marriage would be different. Maybe Arthur, an intellectual, would appreciate Marilyn's mind, not just her body. But the pattern repeated. Arguments, pressure, expectations. Marilyn called Frank less and less. When she did call, she sounded tired, defeated. In 1960, Marilyn's marriage to Arthur Miller fell apart. She was filming The Misfits and having a breakdown on set. Stories of her being hours late, forgetting lines, crying in her trailer. Frank wanted to fly to Nevada where they were filming, wanted to tell her to walk away, that no movie was worth her sanity. But he didn't. He regretted that for the rest of his life. August 5th, 1962. Frank Sinatra was at a restaurant in Los Angeles when he got the phone call. Marilyn Monroe was dead, found in her bedroom. Pills. The official story was suicide, though conspiracy theories would swirl for decades. Frank felt like he'd been shot. He sat in that restaurant, the phone receiver in his hand, and couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he'd just heard. His mind immediately went back to that night in June 1954. To Marilyn sitting on the floor of her dressing room saying, "I think about dying sometimes." To the promise she'd made to call him before she did anything. She hadn't called. She'd broken her promise. Or maybe she'd just forgotten. Maybe in her final moments, she'd been so alone she hadn't remembered that someone had promised to answer. Frank didn't go to Marilyn's funeral. He couldn't. He couldn't stand in a room full of people who'd used her, exploited her, contributed to her death, and pretend to mourn. Joe DiMaggio arranged the funeral. He banned most of Hollywood. Frank respected him for that. At least Joe had tried to protect her, even if he hadn't understood her. For weeks after Marilyn's death, Frank was unreachable. He canceled performances. He drank heavily. He sat in his house replaying every conversation he'd had with Marilyn, wondering what he could have done differently. Wondering if he could have saved her if he'd just tried harder. Dean Martin came to visit him. Dean sat with Frank in silence for hours. Finally, Frank spoke. "I knew she was in pain, Dean. I saw it. And I did nothing?" "You did what you could," Dean said quietly. "You were there for her. You listened. You cared. That's more than most people did." "It wasn't enough," Frank said bitterly. "She's dead. My being there for her didn't save her." Dean didn't argue. He just sat with Frank in his grief. Because sometimes there's nothing to say. Sometimes pain just has to be felt. In the months that followed, Frank changed. People who knew him noticed it. He became more protective of young performers, more aware of the damage Hollywood could do. When he saw someone struggling, he didn't walk past their dressing room. He knocked. He checked. He made sure they knew someone cared. In 1963, Frank was at a recording studio when he saw a young singer, clearly overwhelmed and on the verge of tears. Frank walked over. "You okay, kid?" The young singer, probably 19 years old, tried to smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Sinatra. Just nervous." Frank saw through it immediately. "Come with me for a minute." He took the kid to an empty room. "Tell me what's really going on." The kid broke down. Talked about the pressure, the expectations, the feeling of being crushed under the weight of everyone's demands. Frank listened, and when the kid finished, Frank said, "You have someone you can call when it gets too heavy. Someone who understands." The kid shook his head. Frank pulled out a business card and wrote his number on it. "Now you do. Day or night. You call me." "Promise." The kid looked at the card like it was made of gold. "Really, Mr. Sinatra. Really. And I mean it. This business will chew you up if you let it. Don't let it. And don't be afraid to ask for help." Frank did that dozens of times over the years, gave his number to young performers who looked like they were drowning. Some called, some didn't, but they all knew someone was paying attention. In 1971, a reporter asked Frank about Marilyn Monroe. "Did you know her well?" Frank's jaw tightened. "I knew her well enough to know she deserved better than what she got." "What do you think happened to her?" "I think Hollywood killed her. Slowly. Over years. Everyone wanted a piece of her until there was nothing left. And then when she broke, everyone acted surprised." The reporter pressed. "Do you think she killed herself?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I think she was tired. I think she was in pain. I think she felt alone, even though she was surrounded by people. And I think she stopped seeing a way forward. That's not suicide. That's surrender. And this town drove her to it." The interview never aired. The network deemed it too controversial. But Frank didn't care. He'd said what needed to be said. Years later, in 1985, Frank was at a charity event when someone asked him who the most talented person he'd ever known was. Without hesitation, Frank said, "Marilyn Monroe." People laughed. They thought he was making a joke about her looks. Frank's expression went cold. "I'm serious. Marilyn Monroe was one of the most talented, intelligent, sensitive people I ever met. The fact that everyone remembers her as a sex symbol instead of as an artist is a tragedy. She could have been one of the greatest actresses of all time if this industry had let her." The room went silent. Nobody laughed after that. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, among his personal belongings was a photograph. It was from that night at the Coconut Grove in June 1954. Frank and Marilyn together, both smiling for the camera. But if you looked closely at their eyes, you could see something else. Recognition. Understanding. Two people who knew what it was like to be lonely in a crowd. On the back of the photograph, in Frank's handwriting, were 5 words. "I should have done more." Frank Sinatra spent 40 years carrying the weight of Marilyn Monroe's death, wondering if he could have saved her. Wondering if one more phone call, one more visit, one more reminder that someone cared would have made the difference. He never got an answer to that question. None of us do. But what Frank did do was change how he saw other people's pain. He stopped walking past closed doors when he heard crying. He stopped assuming people were okay just because they smiled. He stopped letting people suffer alone when he had the power to sit with them in their darkness. That night in June 1954, when Frank Sinatra knocked on Marilyn Monroe's dressing room door, He saw something that changed him forever. He saw that fame doesn't protect you from pain. Success doesn't cure loneliness. Beauty doesn't shield you from despair. And he learned that sometimes the greatest thing you can do for someone isn't to fix their problems. It's just to sit on the floor with them and let them know they're not alone. Frank Sinatra couldn't save Marilyn Monroe, but he tried. He saw her. He listened to her. He told her she mattered. And in her darkest moments, maybe that gave her a few more days, a few more reasons to hold on. Maybe it didn't. We'll never know. But Frank tried, and he spent the rest of his life making sure other people knew someone was willing to try for them too.